Good, Mike? All right, I'm going to do a 5 count. So 5, 4, 3. How are you doing, Don?
Pretty good. How are you, Cameron?
I'm doing well. Monsignor Don Romito here
Yeah.
with me today.
Yeah, that's right. Although I don't use that title, it's an honorary title.
So you, just a quick little background here, Monsignor Don, and I'll call you Don for the remainder
Good.
of the interview.
Okay, fine.
Because you're retired now, correct? But
I re-
still active.
I'm still active.
Right.
Yeah.
So Monsignor Don and I, we go way back. You were my pastor at my parish, right? Right when I became a Catholic, basically.
That's right. I remember.
Yep. And we've had many of good conversation over the years, many a good times over the years.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. And so you retired from the diocese when? What? How long ago?
Well, you never really retire from the diocese. I retired from active ministry two years ago, and I'm still a member of the diocese.
And
Now I help out on weekends at a parish in Placentia,
Right.
St. Joseph.
right. One of the things that always struck me about you versus other priests that I've interacted with over the years is you always struck me as a real free thinker, and you thought it seemed differently than other priests in terms of you're very well read. You've got just an incredibly sharp mind in terms of thinking about things, about religion and how it affects our lives and how you've grown up with religion. And I thought that it would be great to have you in and to talk about religion, Catholicism, how
Okay.
it was,
Okay.
how it is now, and
Okay.
and to talk about that journey for you and kind of the journey then for the rest of us these days, and what we can,
Right.
where religion's going and what we can get out of it, right?
Right.
Right. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, right. I mean, we live in very interesting times today, with all of the divisions in our country politically and culturally and religiously, and in terms of every aspect of our culture, everything from sex to politics to, we're so divided right now. And religion used to be, and it can still be, a cause of bringing people together. If all the religions, the diverse religions, could come together and see what we have in common, maybe we could diffuse some of the vitriol and some of the challenges we have, the divisions and all that.
Now, in your studies were in comparative religions.
Well, not exactly. I have a degree from Emory University in Atlanta in theology and literature, so I did a lot. I had a degree in English from Catholic U in Washington, a BA and an MA. And so there was this program out of Emory, one of the few in the country at the time. This is going back, I got my degree in 60s, well, I started the program in 69, and I finished my degree in 76 with PhD. One of the few PhD programs in theology and literature. Well, that was perfect for me because I knew a lot about English lit, American lit, that kind of stuff, and I taught that in high school in the 60s and the 70s while I was getting my degree. So I could do that. Also, I was in the seminary, so I was finishing my seminary studies as well. So gave me a good background that way. But it's not sort of comparative only in the sense of it was all Christian stuff. So I'm not too well versed in the Muslim faith, Buddhist faith, Hindu religion.
And when people have a disconnect. So one of the things that I learned, for the lack of a better term, hanging out with you over those years that you were the pastor at our parish, was how normal priests are, right?
Yeah.
And there is this notion from an outsider looking in that somehow you're different, right?
Right.
Talk about growing up, and it would be certainly fascinating for anybody to know what growing up, what you saw, and what led you into the path to being a
Seminary.
priest.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to seem like being from another planet when you reflect back on the 1950s. Now, I was born in 44. I used to tell my students, when I was born when Roosevelt was president. And
That's right. It was the last year that he was president.
And then
right.
one of my students said, "Well, which Roosevelt was that?" No, it was Franklin Roosevelt, 44. The war was still going on. My father was in India during the war, and so he came out of World War II with 2 kids, and my mom, who had raised us, so anyway, coming out of that, rationing, party lines on the telephone, things that people don't even know about today. Anybody that's under 50 just has no experience of the party line where you could get on the phone and someone would be talking and you'd say, "No, I'm on the phone." "Okay, well, can you get off? You've been on for a half hour." Like, "I have an emergency."
Oh, you meaning like there was just one telephone line that everybody used?
For several people would use it, yeah. That they called it a party line, and yeah.
Well, and that goes to the difference in community. I mean, that
sure, but
you
that's
knew who that was on the other end of the line.
Well, right, but I'm saying that's the kind of world that I was born and raised in, and even housing was such a scarcity back in the 1940s, because my father came home from the war, and all the other men came home, and there wasn't any places for them to live, to raise a family. So, for example, my mom was a single mom. She was living in a small rooming house kind of thing. But the lady that owned the house said, "My son's coming home from the war too, and this is the only place I can find. I own this house, and I'm going to give him this room." Well, my mother said, "Well, I'm living here. I'm renting it from you, and my husband is coming home. We need a place to live." Well, anyway, needless to say, with some intervening things with and she was also a relative, so some of my aunts intervened and said, "No, she's going to stay there. You have to find something else." So, but eventually they did find something.
And how many brothers and sisters did you have?
Eventually 7 of us.
Big Catholic family.
Yeah, Italian, half Italian and half Serbian family.
And this was in Ohio, right?
Yeah, outside of Cleveland.
Cleveland.
But it was the Italian side where we lived. We lived in an Italian neighborhood. I should say an Italian ghetto. It was a little enclave, and my father eventually bought a small house in the neighborhood.
And back then, my assumption then is that Italian, everybody in the neighborhood was Catholic.
Everybody was Catholic.
Everybody went to church.
Everybody went to church. Everybody was Catholic, and most of us went to the Catholic school, which was a mile away, and just life was different. All my aunts and uncles lived around us. This has nothing to do with religion exactly, but everybody, we didn't lock our doors in those days. People didn't lock their doors, and not that there'd be anything to find in our little house, but so we would go to one aunt and uncle and see what are you having for dinner, and if it was something we liked, we'd stay for dinner.
And as you grew up, then did you have an inkling early on that you were going to be a priest?
Well,
or did that evolve over time? How did that work?
Yeah, but lots of people did, Cameron. This is so hard for people to understand. It was just assumed that somebody in the family was going to become a priest. I mean, it was a good chance of it, because everybody was Catholic. Everybody went to church. I was an altar boy. The Mass was in Latin, and I learned all the Latin prayers, and I was a smart little kid, and the priest kind of took an interest in my studies, and so I was the head altar boy. By the time I was in 7th grade, I was teaching the other kids, And the nuns in grade school, they all, said, "Oh, you should think about becoming a priest." And I said, "Well, I love the Mass. We loved all of that stuff around the church because that was just part of the thing, loving the Catholic stuff, all the incense and all the prayers, and it was the singing and all that. I know, I just loved all of that stuff. So.
And when did you then make that decision?
Excuse me.
When did it come up for you that you said to yourself, okay, this is it. This is what I want to do?
Not in those early days, not very much. I thought about it, and after 8th grade was a good time. A lot of kids went after 8th grade. And a lot of women, too, a lot of young girls joined the convent after 8th grade, 13, 14 years old. This was not it would not have been like shocking to anybody that you went away to the seminary or to the convent. The seminaries were full. The convents were full. So after 8th grade, I thought about it and talked about it with my folks. And my father says, "Well, why don't you go? There's a new Catholic high school being built. They just had the first class last year. Why don't you think about going to the Catholic school, and then you can decide during your high school years what you want to do, because it's, you're a little young to be doing that." I was also 4 years old when I started because I was my birthday, things like that. So, and in those days they pushed you ahead rather than kept you back.
Yeah,
so I was 4 years old. There I was in first grade, and so I was 12 when they were in 8th grade, when a lot of kids were 13 and 14. 14, they were shaving, and I was like, "What is this?" And some of my friends are already shaving and going out with girls, or wanting to. And I would say wanting to, because you didn't go out in those at 14, period.
Right.
But even the expression "going out," that's so foreign to kids today, foreign to young people. To say I'm going out with somebody, you don't. That's not how it works today, as you know, Cameron.
Yes.
Being around.
Well, I have a 14-year-old at home now. Can you believe that?
I can believe it. Yeah,
Right?
I know. But anyway, so I was just too young to make that kind of decision. My father knew that too, my mother. So my mother's a convert, so she learned all of this stuff from her Serbian Orthodox religion. And
so then you make this transition. What was the aha moment for you? Where were you?
I'll tell you. It was so I graduated from high school in '62, and I had lots of scholarship offers. I wanted to go to an Ivy League school. I was accepted at a couple of them, Columbia and Dartmouth, but I got a full scholarship to University of Dayton, which was a Catholic college run by the Marianist order. And my high school was run by the Marist order. They're very closely related. And so it was hard to turn that down. So I went to University of Dayton in the fall of '62. Well, if you remember, well, you weren't born, but
I know my history.
But the history, 1962 in the fall, that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was the Gary Powers and the U-2 incident and all of that stuff. So we really thought, those of us, we were freshmen in college, at a Catholic college, and again, hard to believe, but we thought we were going to be drafted immediately, and we could be sent off to Cuba or somewhere. That's how serious that Cuban Missile Crisis was, and it was kind of. So we were all anyway get in line for confession. Everybody's in line for confession to the chaplain, who lived on our floor.
Oh, it was 13 days on the brink. I mean, it was the closest we came to nuclear war ever.
It was. So we were all, But back up a little bit from that. In 1960, this was a time when I really got excited about my religion. One, we were just elected a Catholic president in 1960, the first Catholic, and it was kind of exciting to be Catholic in those days. We have a Catholic president, and a lot of my friends that were not Catholic, not that I had a lot of non-Catholic friends, but the ones I did, they were very, wondering what's the Catholic religion all about. And those of us who were Catholic are very proud that we had this Catholic president. And not only that, but in a couple years before that, in 1958, the church elected a new pope. We had this pope for 20 years, all through World War II, who was a very mystical kind of a guy, very abstemious, very, he was very thin, he looked like what you'd think of as a saint, Pope Pius XII.
Pius, that's what I thought it was.
And so he was the pope, and he all through those years, for 20 years, and he died in 58, and the church elects this happy warrior, this guy. He weighed about 300 pounds. He was very outgoing, very friendly, and cracking jokes. And this was the Pope. And he says, let's open a lot of windows in the church. And he says, I want to have a Vatican Council, a Second Vatican Council. Get all the bishops together, and let's open the windows of the church into the modern world. Wow, well, we were so excited. I was 18, 16 when the council was called, 18 when it started in 1962. So there we were, Catholic president and a new church, a modern church, and they did all kinds of wonderful things like putting the Mass into English, and also just getting people happy and excited about their faith.
It was getting more lay people involved, right?
And, well, of course. And so also, but it encouraged so many people my age to, if we weren't already thinking about the church, to join the seminary and the convent. And that just exploded. So in the early 60s, there I was in freshman year in college. I was majoring in English, but thinking very much about the priesthood at that point. I said, I've given this a lot of thought, but I put it off. But now look how exciting. This is how wonderful. I want to be a part of this church. I want to be a part of this new modern church. And I want to do, as Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you're going to do for your country. And that was something that we were patriotically interested in doing, giving back to the country.
And when you started as a priest, a young priest, talk about how that's changed, how the church and how worship and how participation has really changed from the time that you started back in the. You were ordained when?
I was ordained in 74.
74. So
I entered in 63. I entered that next year.
Right.
1963. I entered the seminary.
So 63 to 70. So that's 9 years of study. Is that
11 years.
11 years of study.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, 63. Yeah. Well, I'm a poli-sci major.
Well, I was still in college though, so I graduated from college in 67 with a BA. So, yeah, we were in the seminary, but it was more like we went to regular school, regular university.
Knowing that you were headed to the seminary after that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We did live in a seminary building, a dorm. Remember, just in my little religious order, because I joined this order where I went to high school, Marist order, and just in my little order, which is a small order, and today it's much, much smaller, but in those days it was a small order anyway, there were 45 of us just in our one class, just in our year. So if you put all 4 years of college together, you had hundreds of students. And
it reminds me, I went to Vietnam 2 years ago now, and in Vietnam, I went with my father-in-law, who is close with the bishop of the diocese that covers like Saigon and whatnot. maybe just outside of that. Doesn't matter. We went to a seminary there.
Right.
They had 500 seminarians
Okay.
there. And 100 of them were out on the parade deck doing karate one morning, all dressed up in their cheese, and it was really cool.
Wow.
Yeah, it was quite fascinating to see that. And I can imagine that back then that was probably what it looked like.
And only about 10 or 15%, maybe a little bit more now, of Vietnamese are Catholic.
Yeah, it is a small.
So that's
percentage.
a small percentage, and so the fact that the seminary would be that crowded, that's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And so
That's how it was in Washington, D.C., where I went to Catholic U there. That's where the seminary was. Just our small order, we had all of our hundreds of people, and then think of all the orders, religious orders in Washington, D.C. Each one had its own building. The Paulists, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Franciscans had the Franciscan college, a huge dorm filled with students. So we all went to Catholic U. I mean, and that's just the guys. The women had their own, more numbers of girls, young women, going to the convents and coming out, being educated. So it was not weird at all. Oh, you're in the seminary. No, that was not weird at all. And people would say, how many are priests in your family? And then a lot of people would say, oh, well, 3 brothers are priests and 2 sisters are nuns and whatever. Everyone had big families and lots of what we call lots of vocations.
So where did things?
Well, but here's what happened what happened in the 1960s. That was 1963 when I entered, and I said about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was resolved. But Kennedy was shot in '63 and killed. Imagine what that did to our. I was in Washington. I went to his funeral. I stayed outside St. Matthew's Cathedral where he was. The cortege would walk by. I have a picture of that we didn't have selfies or anything in those days. I had a camera and I took a picture of the casket going by. So, but I thought, the world is changing, and of course the Vatican Council was just beginning, so that was exciting and very positive. Aggiornamento, the Pope called it, updating. That was all good. But in our country, after the death of Kennedy in '63, we had the beginnings of a lot of divisions and divisiveness. The civil rights movement in '65 with Martin Luther King. There I was that summer of '65 when the passage of the Civil Rights Act, because Johnson was now president. We all were on the side of civil rights and Martin Luther King. And when he gave that "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, I went to it. I was standing with 1 million people. Oh, maybe more. I don't know. I've never seen such a crowd. We walked from our seminary. We walked to the U.S. Capitol, which was a long walk. But we spent the day there walked to the.
And you heard you heard the speech.
Well, I heard. We didn't know. Oh, this is the most historic speech ever in history in the civil rights. We didn't think of it that way. We just knew Martin Luther King was speaking. It was a big deal, and it became the "I Have a Dream" speech. Yeah. And so that was very exciting.
What was the crowd mix-up like that day?
I'm trying to remember. I was just with all of my friends, and we were all seminarians and everything. We had to wear our white shirts and black pants, so everybody knew we were different, a little different. Lots of black, of course, a lot of black people. I just remember that. But we were happy to be one big family. And when King says we want to be part of a movement that recognizes people not for their color of their skin, but for the content of their character, we were so excited about that. And civil rights was a big deal for me in my young life, and the church was behind all of these too, the civil rights movement, and But you want to know how things have changed. I mean, can you imagine? That has become almost a racist thing to say, to accept people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. You say that today, and you're condemned as a racist.
Yes.
But for me, that's one of the fundamental principles of my life, and I can't change that, and don't want to change that.
And that basis is rooted historically in Judeo-Christian beliefs.
Of course it is, sure.
And where does that come from in the Bible?
Well, gee,
I'm just gonna I just moved your mic there.
oh, okay.
We're both
Okay.
enthralled, and I want to make sure we're getting it all.
Well, I mean, it comes from the great commandment: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat other people as you would want to be treated. You know.
But the notion of the individual, though, the notion of that the individual, it's not the group, it's the individual that the founders knew had to be propped up in order to have this
right.
great system that we have here work. I mean, that was rooted in
Right.
in
Right.
Christianity.
Right. The Judeo-Christian faith. So the Jewish people were way ahead of us in that civil rights movement. The Jewish people have always been leaders in civil rights because they had been persecuted too. So had the blacks, and so then we said African Americans. Around that time, we started saying African American. Now there's all kinds of different words now, but in those days, the Jewish people, we learned that and then we learned a lot in the seminary. I learned a lot about how the Catholic Church had discriminated against the Jewish people in particular, in terms of religious discrimination.
Well, if we want to go back too, there's quite a bit of discussion that I've read regarding Pope Pius and kind of looking the other way on the extermination of the Jews during World War II.
Yeah, that's a controversy and a big debate.
Sure.
I don't know. I've read all the literature on it, and I kind of side, as you might suspect, with the fact that he did a lot of things secretly that he couldn't do publicly.
Right.
The Pope, and I think he did an awful lot. We know he did an awful lot of taking care of shepherding Jews out of Germany, out of Italy, out of the fascist countries. But here's the thing: the wonderful Pope, and I loved Pope Pius XII. I grew up with him. He was the Pope all through my growing up years. We had a picture of the Pope in our house, so we thought a lot of him. He was a saint of his own kind. He was as I say, very frail and fragile and but he loved beauty of any kind. He loved beautiful music, and he loved the German music. He loved the German people. He was Italian himself, Pacelli, but he loved everything German. I mean, so Beethoven and Brahms and all of the great composers, he loved all of that. Wagner, he loved all that kind of music. So it's not surprising that he would have an affinity for the German people, which he did. Did that color his decisions about the politics of Hitler? I'm sure he didn't want to believe that Hitler was so evil because he was German or whatever he was, but pretty soon during the war, the Pope had to have seen, and he did see, the evil of the Third Reich, and so that had to overcome, and it did. It overcame even his love for the German people and German music and German art. But I don't know.
Hard to say.
Yeah. But in any case, we were talking about what changed in the 60s. So in 65 and 66, here I was in school, finishing my BA degree in English at Catholic U, And in '67, things were heating up in the civil rights movement. It was not as cohesive as it was in the early part of the '60s. And then in '68, when Martin Luther King was shot and killed in April, I can't tell you what that did, because we all remembered John Kennedy in '63, and then in April of '68, at that point I was teaching. I had finished my degree, and I was teaching high school to a bunch of juniors and seniors in high school, and the last part of the school year, April, May, and then in June, there we were just finishing school, and Bobby Kennedy gets shot and killed.
It's like one after another back then. And then you have the Vietnam War.
And in the meantime, the Vietnam War is ramping up and going on. And my point is that by 1968, and then '69, when I finished my MA degree, and I finished up another school year of teaching, the seminary started emptying out, because we went from being so optimistic and so upbeat about life and about the church and about our country, patriotism, all of that was at such a high level that by the end of that '60s, with the Vietnam War, we were questioning our own country and its values, and the Richard Nixon and all of that stuff. The Watergate scandal was beginning. So we're questioning our politics, our government, and after King died, then the splintering of the civil rights movement. People like Jesse Jackson were conflicted about whether to remain
passive,
or
not passive.
So what I want to say is
peaceful.
centrist,
Right.
or to become more leftist or left wing, and you can't blame him when his leader was shot and killed. He was right there. Jesse Jackson was right there with him. So the civil rights movement had splintered into factions, and you had the radicals, Malcolm X, and I spent a lot of time reading about him. And
I actually watched. It came up on my YouTube feed, an interview with Malcolm X and a commentator, and it struck me as it was so eye-opening how civil the discourse was.
Mm-hmm.
So you had Malcolm X with these at the time were radical ideas, and you had the I'm assuming the white male conservative talk show host, but they sat there and they had this very respectful conversation. And the one thing I found so fascinating about Malcolm X was compared to today's pundits, compared to today, like the Al Sharptons and the Jesse Jacksons of the world. Malcolm X was amazingly literate. He was amazingly articulate. He spoke eloquently. He spoke brilliantly. And even if I don't agree with everything that he said, he discussed his point of view with such beauty that you couldn't help but really respect the guy for what he was trying to achieve, even if you didn't necessarily agree with it. Right. And the other thing that I found very fascinating about that interview also was the civility of it.
Okay.
There was not the shouting down that we're accustomed to today, right? The interviewer let him say what he wanted to say. And that's where I see this real breakdown that's occurred in America, as obviously currently as today stands, but it did start back in the 60s, right? And that's the genesis of it. And my thoughts have always been on that Johnson's Great Society, that was the beginning of, not the end per se, but it was the beginning of the destruction of the American family, the destruction of religion in this country, because it was basically supplanting all those things that religion did for people, charity, welfare, etc., supplanting that with government.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's such a big deal, because the key the key to the black family in those days was strong. I remember Jesse Jackson saying, I remember a speech of his that I don't know if he came to the university or if we just went to hear him. But that was another thing. White people were certainly welcome at his talks. We went to all kinds of people's talks, in those days. And I remember him saying, "You black women, you have many babies. Have lots of babies." That's the kind of way he would talk. We want you to, we need you. We know all your children. We need lots of black children to grow up to be strong citizens and to be strong members of our black community. So he encouraged, he was very pro-life. And I remember that. I mean, you can look it up and see exactly what he did say.
Have babies with intact families, correct?
Yes, have babies with your mom and dad, and he would encourage the fathers. Stay with, be with your. In those days, the black family wasn't as disrupted, as fractured as it is today by any means. And so, the black fathers, yes, stay with your family and have many kids and raise them up, and not to go on welfare, but to be productive citizens, and that's how things are going to change. Even you mentioned Malcolm X in your interview. I bet that interview took place at the end of his life, and earlier in his career he was a lot more radical.
I don't know much about him. I just know that interview that I saw.
We lived, those of us who lived through all of that remember how he changed. By the end of his life, when he was assassinated, sees all these people that were killed, he was accepting more the black Muslim religion. He was treating his Muslim faith with a great seriousness by that in those days, and coming to some real stuff about peace and
so he was
justice.
Moderating his views at that point.
Yes, I think. Well, I'm not black, and I'm no expert on Malcolm X, but I remember that.
Well, I have a theory, and these kinds of things are dangerous these days, but that's what the show here is about. It's about talking about these things in a rational way. I have a theory about what happened to the black family with the civil rights movement and why it was so torn apart by government policies. And it really boils down to this, is that you can look around at virtually any ethnic group in America, Asians, Hispanics, Persians, Arabs, and you don't see the kind of angst and separation of families the way you see it with the black families these days, right? Father's not around in a black family. He might even, most times he's incarcerated. The mothers are raising the children in black neighborhoods today. There's just this lack of men, and what I think happened. This is what I think happened, is that the African Americans were brought here for slavery, right? And they were enslaved for hundreds of years. And everybody else who came here came under their own power.
Right.
They wanted to immigrate here.
Right.
So they came in, they brought in their own cultures, their own faith, their support systems, their family structures, right? And they built that from the ground up. But African Americans never had that opportunity. Had that opportunity because of slavery. And then what happened was,
they were torn from their families.
And they were torn from their families, of course. And so they have this huge history of slavery and of no foundation. And then they start to build that foundation, right? The foundation is being built during the Civil Rights era. And when you look at the black family back then, they were intact. They lived in ghettos, but they were like any other. They were like the Italian ghettos, right? I mean, they had their problems, but they still had that family intact, and they were building up. And as that went on over time, they were getting better and better about it. And then the Great Society came, the War on Poverty came. And what it did was it too early on, before the foundation was completed for the African American society, culture, here in America. Before that could be completely built, the government came in and took it away, and took away responsibility from the man, the African American man, to have to take care of the woman, and incentivize the woman to have all these kids to get more money from the government. That, coupled with affirmative action, good intentions, bad results, it destroyed them. It
Right.
destroyed them, and they are still
Right.
suffering for that. Had we just given the African American community a generation with no other assistance, no civil, no, other than civil rights, right? No affirmative action, no
Right.
welfare, just giving them that, I think we'd be in such a different place today.
Right. And okay, yeah, I think you need to have a black guy on your
Well,
show.
of course,
to-
and ask
to
that
kinda
question, yes.
And say he'll
Yeah.
say, Cameron, you know nothing,
Well, listen,
and I know nothing compared with that
Well,
too. So,
I
but
see-
I do know another thing: the housing crisis in those days. I remember in the 1960s when I was coming through, there would be huge skyscraper housing projects built in in downtown Cleveland and downtown
Chicago, Cabrini Greens.
and that to me also played a big role in destroying the family unit. Why? Because you lived on the 15th or 20th floor of some apartment, and that was where you raised your family, and it was poor. Then the elevators would be broken, and you'd have to walk up the 20 stairs with your groceries, and it was
It was horrendous. It was horrendous.
And so that set the stage for all of the riots that took place in the 60s in L.A. in 65.
the Watts riot.
Watts, when was that, 67?
Yeah, I don't know the exact date on that.
Cleveland in 67, my hometown, my home state of Ohio, and in Cleveland, was in flames in the 1960s too, 67, around there. And of course, Washington, D.C., I was still in the seminary, and Washington, D.C. was going up in flames. So the race riots, they call them, but the racial strife was intensified by the housing problem.
And so in the church at that time, when you're ministering in the church, what's the church's position on these
Well,
things at that
let me
time?
just tell you, during the summer there when Washington was burning, the summer of 60, I want to say 68 or 69, I don't know what exactly. The years, we don't think in terms of years too much when we look at our memories. We think in terms of events that happened. But anyway, that summer, whatever summer it was, the seminarians in our area, not only my order, but a bunch of different orders, were taking food in the midst of the flames to the parishes, the black churches in downtown Washington, D.C. We were bringing food, bringing supplies, bringing whatever we needed to do. We were in solidarity with the people who were suffering, and it was dangerous too. Some of my friends really were going into dangerous situations. But the pastors of those parishes, they were usually white, and a lot of them were Irish, because in those days the Irish clergy was so dominant.
Kind of like the Vietnamese today.
Yeah, sort of like that in Orange County anyway. But so here's the white pastor, and his church is black, and he needs people to they need food, they need money. And so the seminarians would go, and they would help out. We'd go in groups in caravans and cars to help out while the city's burning. This is this is where the church was, and we were very proud of what the church did in those days. And for the most part, we were welcomed. Today, I don't know how it would be today.
When did you see that? So after the turmoil of the 60s, and as we approach into the 70s, the drawdown on Vietnam, 74, 75, obviously, when Saigon finally fell in '75, and there was this kind of return to some normalcy in the country.
Well,
And I use
but
that
not
term,
in the church.
But not in the church. That's what I was going to say. Like, so how were things
Well,
changing during those times?
Well, 50 years ago today, this week, 1968, the Pope issues an encyclical on the birth control pill and on contraception. And everybody thought, including me and all of my friends and all of the young married couples that I knew, I mean, it was almost universal among young people in the 1960s and 68, thought that the Pope was going to change the teaching of the church on this. I was a senior in college.
Change it which way?
In favor of allowing the birth control pill and in favor of artificial means of contraception, allowing it.
And back then, so just...
And he had a commission. The Pope set up a commission to study this question of a whole range of Catholic people, lay people, priests,
And what did
nuns.
So before you get to what happened, what did people want versus what
Well, they wanted to be given the permission of the church, of the Pope, really, of the church, to plan their families using the birth control pill or condoms or however they wanted to plan their family. But the pill had just been invented, and so that's why that was a big deal, and people were wondering about its side effects and so on of that. But that's what everybody thought, and the commission came back to the Pope and said almost unanimously, allow the artificial contraception, allow allow this to happen. And the Pope thought about it, and he agonized over it. And I can appreciate it. He was agonizing over it. He had been brought in as Pope after John the 23rd died, and he comes in. He's another one of these severe people compared with the Pope before him, John the 23rd. So he thinks all these things through, and he said it was the most difficult decision of his role as Pope. So after 15 years in the job, from 63 to 78 when he died, he was never the same. But in 68, he says, nope, there's not going to be any change. I reject the commission's findings, and we're just going to keep the lid on, and Catholics may not use birth control pills, they may not use condoms, they may not do anything artificial in having their families. Well, there I was as a senior, and as I say, a senior in college, finishing my master's degree. Well, I guess I was in those days my first year in my master's degree. We marched on Catholic University, the students, and a lot of faculty joined us in marching. A priest by the name of Charles Curran, a great prophet, and one of my teachers, he encouraged us in saying that we should be able to dissent from this teaching.
And is that the moment when modern day America had a falling off with the church?
Well, yes. You know what this, after it's been 50 years now, but what has happened in those 50 years is people said, I can't accept this teaching of the church, young people. Most of them, I'm not saying all by any means, because there was such division in the church in those days, but most of the Catholics said, I can't accept this teaching. It's ridiculous. I can't use a condom to plan my family. I can't use the pill, which is now coming out to be harmless in every way except in avoiding pregnancy. Why can I not do this? Certainly abortion wasn't part of the equation until 74, when that became the law of the land. But this is 68, and people said, okay, I can't accept this teaching. I'm going to practice birth control. And that's what all of my friends did, and I was a celibate guy. I'm in the seminary. It doesn't affect me that way, but all of my family members, my friends, young married couples, because as seminarians we used to go out to the parishes during the weekends, and we got to meet a lot of people. And the Christian family movement, which was such a strong movement in those days, the CFM movement, most of those people in that movement were conflicted, and so they said, well, we're going to have to go our own way on this issue. We cannot follow the teachings of the Pope on this. Well, Cameron, it's only a small step. If you say, I can dissent from this teaching, it becomes a very small step to say, well, then why do I have to go to Mass every Sunday?
Yes.
Why do I have to accept the teaching of the Church about, I don't know, any number of issues? And so particularly Mass attendance went way down, because people said, well,
literally like overnight, just
over the next 10 years, and said, I'm still Catholic. If you would talk to any young person in their 20s that grew up Catholic like I did, if you said to them, a young family that's using birth control, you say, are you still Catholic? He says, of course I'm Catholic. Nothing's going to change that. I'm still Catholic, but I use birth control, and I don't go to Mass much anymore, because my relationship with the Church has changed. And so now only about, I don't know what the statistics are, but about a third of the registered Catholic families attend church with any regularity, And they think they can do this with impunity, because that's, I can't believe the Pope on this, and this, so then, hey.
Throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Yeah,
basically.
right. Okay, so that's the end of the authority of the Pope declined so much. And then here I am being ordained a priest in the midst of all of this. And it used to be when I growing up, if the priest said something, oh my gosh, you unthinkingly followed it. My father, I wanted to learn how to swim when I was a kid. And so my father said, well, the YMCA has a swimming instructions, and they have a pool. Why don't you take instruction? I said, oh, I'd love to do that. So, but my father said, good Catholic that he was, well, we better call the priest and see if you can join, because it's the Young Men's Christian Association. It's not Catholic. So I said, well, okay. I mean, here I'm just a little kid. I'm like, what am I, 10 or 11, 12? So my father calls the priest. Absolutely not. You cannot you cannot join the YMCA. You cannot take any swimming lessons from the Y. And even then, I knew that was kind of dumb, and my father did too. And so we did. We went to the classes anyway. So I mean, this is the breakdown of authority was beginning that way too.
So there's a breakdown of authority in the nation, just in general.
Right. And then the Vatican Council had opened up the Church to a lot of other things, like, can you go to a Protestant wedding? Can you go to the wedding of a Protestant? Now, that seems so quaint today to even think about it. But again, my music teacher's daughter was getting married. I was about 16. And we were invited to the wedding. And my father said, well, yeah, let's go to the wedding. We know the family. And we called the church. Absolutely not. You cannot enter that church, the Methodist church. Can't go to the wedding. So that's the change from then. That would be so ridiculous today to even think about calling the priest about something
I
like
didn't
that.
I didn't even know that happened back then.
Oh, yeah. No, you weren't allowed to.
And that makes me think now why people have this. I have people who say weird things to me, like, oh, well, the Catholic Church, they just try to control everything about you.
Well,
and look,
they
there's
did.
no Bibles in the pews.
It wasn't
right?
that they were trying to control. They just were wanting to preserve that Catholic identity in those days. That's what they were doing. It wasn't an evil thing.
Do you think that if the Pope hadn't have done that, if he had have said, okay, that's fine, we'll allow you to do birth control,
right?
Do you think that would have changed changed the trajectory of where the church is today, or just slowed it down?
I think it would have certainly slowed it down and maybe even changed it because so many things flowed from that. Like the Vatican Council, all the other changes were accepted wonderfully by the people. Mass in English, education of kids, in the sacraments, that was all opened up to lay people distributing communion. And having communion from both the chalice as well as the hosts, that's today, again, we think of that as normal, but in those days that was a big deal. I remember that change when we were allowed to receive from the cup at Mass. Big deal. Now, if anyone listening to this who's not Catholic is saying, "Well, you're so ridiculous that you would even..." No, it wasn't. We didn't think of it as ridiculous. It was just part of being Catholic. Just as I think the Mormon Church today has its own traditions and its own faiths and its own desire to keep that Mormon identity strong. The Muslim people have their own desire to keep their Muslim faith strong. And that's how it was in the Catholic Church too.
And do you, how did all of that in the 60s then change your perspective when you over the years, and how you dealt with things as a priest?
The biggest change was that we lost our fatherly relationship to the church. It was, motherly, because we always called it Holy Mother, the Church. And that relationship, the Pope as our father, our secular father, our earthly shepherd, that trust was broken in 1968, and it continued to break down. And so in the late 60s, that's when the seminaries emptied. 69, 70, 71. All of my friends left the seminary. I told you we started with 45 people just in my one class. By 1972, there were like five of us left, and got ordained in 1974. There were
That's
1,
staggering.
2, 3. Yeah, and of those five, I bet there's a couple of others. Most of those five are still priests active today, but everybody emptied out. The seminaries emptied out, and you can imagine Washington, D.C., it wasn't just happening with our order. All the orders were emptying out of that. And the convents, all of the young girls leaving the convent for that. I don't know.
What do you think? In terms of
it can't
that,
all be because of the birth control encyclical. It was just the modern.
Well, it was the times. It was the modern times.
And it can't all be because a lot of people blame the Vatican Council for all of this. Yeah. I don't blame the council. In fact, I think if we had put the council into real effect, which would have included a married clergy and women ministers of.
Two things on that. Well, first is, what do you think that massive deflation of religion, best way I can think to describe that right now, all at once, what do you think that did for American society? And after that, then I do want to touch on the celibacy portion of the priesthood.
Well,
so when you have all these people,
there's been a breakdown of the family, not only as we talked about the black family, but numbers of divorces in the Catholic Church, which in those days was very rare for a Catholic to get a divorce, and the number of annulments were very few in those days. But there too, there's this sense of give people another chance. People were shunned if they were divorced in the Catholic Church. You could hardly even go to church. A lot of people didn't go to church anymore because they were treated with disdain.
Like pariahs.
Yeah.
But how did that change American society, though, as you saw it?
Well, it was the breakdown of the family there. As divorces increased and I don't know. it just led to the breakdown of authority for sure in the church, and breakdown of authority in the family, and Catholic families were no longer the big structure. People weren't having big families anymore.
Yeah.
Partly because they can't afford it. And how many kids do you have? Two kids.
Yeah.
You know how expensive that is.
Yeah.
So imagine if you had 7 kids.
Yeah, I don't know how people did that.
Yeah. Well, my father says, you just did it. And we all lived, we didn't have our own room. Are you kidding?
Right.
Growing up, your own room. Now, this is one of the reasons when I went to the seminary was I get to have my own room. And then I found out, no, you have to have a roommate because this was so crowded. So we had.
This came up in my interview with another person about the clergy and celibacy, and that there's no biblical reference for celibacy of priests. What's the answer on that, and what are your thoughts on the celibacy portion of it?
There's a lot of biblical references considering that Jesus was a celibate, and that was the beginning of the tradition, that Jesus was not married. But for economic reasons, around the year 1000, for the beginning, priests were married. The first pope, St. Peter, he was married. And we know that from the Bible. His mother-in-law was sick, and Jesus healed her. So we know that in the early church, people were married. And so the church set up structures. For example, for bishops, you could be married only once, and you couldn't, and things like that. So in those days, marriage was not quite different from what it is today, and betrothals and all of that, very, very different setup. But one of the things that was changed as the church grew, and as we had all these hundreds and thousands of parishes across the world. When a priest would die, he would leave his rectory, he would leave the house to his wife and kids. And they would have the house, and so the new priest would be brought in, and
he's got this woman and these kids in here.
No, yeah, they couldn't throw her out. She was the widow of the priest. So the new priest would come in, and he had his wife. So the church had to find a house for him, which they did. They had to buy a house. They had to pay a salary for him, and take care too of the first wife, of the widow. And so then when he would die, his wife inherited the stuff, and so on. You can see that as time went on, this was a big, expensive deal. Not only that, but the bishop in those days, he would have let's say Irvine. Use Irvine as an example. Okay, the priest with his family in Irvine, his family had roots. The kids went to school in Irvine. The kids, they would go to UCI for college and stuff like that. Well, it would be very difficult for the bishop in those days to say, "Oh, by the way, I need somebody to go to Garden Grove now, and Father, we want you to go. You take." And he says, "What? Take my family? We have roots where kids are in school in Irvine, and we like it here." No, we want you to go to Garden Grove. Well, the transfers were difficult too in those days. I'm just trying to abstract. It was nothing like that, but.
Fair to say, it came down to economics.
It came down to economics and authority. The bishop needed two things. He needed to have cheap labor, which he got from a celibate clergy, and he needed authority to move them around, to move us around. And so now we even have term limits in most dioceses in the Catholic Church.
So do you think that that's going to remain in this modern day and age? Do you think it's going to remain that way, or do you think that...
When we were ordained, none of us thought it was going to last for much longer. We all thought that within our lifetime, for sure, that celibacy would be gone as a compulsory thing to be ordained. We all thought that. Books were written assuming
That was going to happen.
that it was going to happen, and we didn't realize the how sturdy the tradition was of for economics and all that, and authority and all that, how things would have to change. So even like today, how things would have to change. Are you ready, Cameron, in your church to triple your weekly offering? To go from, what do you give, $5 a week probably now?
A little more than that. Little more.
$100 a week to support the priest and his family.
Yeah, that's true.
And and they have to send their kids to college. They have to send their kids to high schools and raising a family today. And you have to give him a decent salary to be able to do that. And
then what do you do when that goes south, or they get?
So you'd have to give the priest at least a salary of $100,000 a year, compared with what I got, which is, you don't even want to know. It was not.
Yeah, well, you were probably paid pretty well, even compared to, say, Father Conlon in our parish, who was like, I mean, he made nothing.
Exactly, he did.
He made
the
nothing.
The nuns made $1 a day for teaching in the schools. Why? Because, well, they were given, of course, the convent and the room and board and all of that, but there was no thought of retirement for the nuns. So and there were so many of them. Oh, there'll be another group of 100 nuns coming in down the pike.
Well, and you can see with American culture too, where fame and fortune and consumerism are such big deals now.
Sure.
That makes it even
and
harder.
And the women's movement, the feminist movement, all of that. But those nuns worked for nothing because they were working for God, and there was always people to take their place. And the lifestyle was so consistent and so good. Nutritious meals, regular habits, regular meals, 3 meals a day. And the life of a young woman was so regimented and whatever, that the nuns lived and are still living 80s, 90s, 100. Well, they're not being replaced by anybody today, so there's no money coming in to
keep it going.
To keep it going, and so now we, in our country, we take up a collection every year for, in every church, for the retirement fund for the sisters that are retired, and it helps to pay for the retirement, all of the housing, the medical care for elderly nuns.
Where do you see religion heading in this country? Where do you see Catholicism heading in this country? Because, I mean, you have Pope Francis right now, who is clearly trying to make some reforms.
Just this morning, he says that the death penalty has to be
abolished.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah,
it's not a deterrent anyway.
I don't either. We've been a church of pro-life church forever, and the consistent ethic of life from
beginning to end,
from beginning to natural death.
Right.
So I agree with that teaching, of course, but not everybody does in this country.
Sure.
Not every Catholic does.
Sure.
It's going to be interesting. So.
But where do you see the church headed? Do you see that are we going to be able to increase the number of people who become Catholic over time, or is that just number going to keep dwindling?
Catholic Church is growing in numbers primarily because of Latin America, Central America, Mexico.
Growing in those countries, or are they
growing in those countries? And a lot of in this country, they're immigrating to this country, and they're having lots of kids, for the most part, and they're having more kids anyway. So the numbers are increasing. The numbers are increasing in our country from that perspective. But in terms of the traditional white families, white Catholic, Italian, Irish, Polish, German, those numbers are declining. And in Europe,
Europe is abysmal.
Right. So. But it's a mistake to think that religion is going to be declining. That's a misnomer going back 50 years when we made the mistake of thinking that secularism is taking over, is going to replace religion. Sociologists thought that. psychologists, not psychologists, but progressivists in the sociology thought that. That has not happened. Religion, all of the religions are strong today. Not only is the Catholic Church growing, granted smaller numbers, with the exception of Western Europe. Look at the Muslim faith growing, the Mormon Church growing, in Latin America, the Catholic Church growing strong, Brazil, Argentina, all of those countries, religion is still a big part of people's lives, and look at in the Protestant religion, the evangelical Protestants growing.
I've always said that I used to look unkindly on what I called the big box churches, right? Like the Mariners of the world. Right. But I'll tell you, I have a 180-degree reversal on that, and in my opinion, those big box churches, like Mariners, for instance, or Saddleback, they're holding the line. Yeah. Right? Because at least the Catholics that are disaffected Catholics, for whatever reason, have a place to go.
Right.
And it's Christianity's a big tent, right?
Yeah, but there's also some disaffected big box people that are coming back to the Catholic Church. So sure. There's a lot of movement. Yeah. Which there never was in the past. You just were wherever you were born, that was it.
Well, but I think to the Catholic Church, to their credit, they've realized, hey, that's going to happen, and they're very welcoming. At least my impression is that we're very welcoming now.
Of course, yes, and we're actively looking for new members all the time.
Well, and it goes back to the tenets of the faith that it is about forgiveness. Right. It's about forgiveness.
Right. And everybody deserves a second chance in life.
That's right.
Maybe even a third chance and a fourth chance. But that's our beauty of our Catholic. That's why I love being Catholic. Who was that on The Simpsons? Was it the Church of the Second Chance or the third? That famous, wherever that was. It's a church where God's mercy is so prevalent, and the opportunity for new starts and new beginnings. That's why the annulment process has been modernized, and people who've experienced divorce can get a new start in our Catholic Church, and it's a wonderful thing to see.
That's one of the things that I actually didn't know about you prior to today. And I'm sorry for this, but you really love the Catholic faith. Some people might think after so many years, 50 years of being a priest, that maybe you would be cynical about it, or it would, you'd be tired of it, or whatnot. Yeah. But it's clear to me you really love the Catholic faith, and it has. And my assumption then on this conversation is that it's only increased over time.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
That's true. But it's really changed a lot, though. When I was a kid, it was an awesome, we were in awe of the whole institution, the church building, with the smells and bells and all of that, and the stained glass windows and all that stuff. We were in awe of all of that. Now, with the rise of the various movements we talked about, the church is now opened to the world, and now it's all about evangelizing and making a difference. And that's why I love being Catholic, because the church is really poised to be available to people to make a difference. And you can still be Catholic today and have your mind, have an intellect.
What are your thoughts on the, there's certain things that so I'll talk about gay marriage, for instance. You can't be gay and married in the church. And that's something that the left and the radical left are just going to keep banging on the church on.
You're right.
And the church considers that, Gene O'Toole, we both know somebody from our parish, used to say big T, little t, big tradition, little tradition. Right. And the big tradition is marriage is between a man and a woman in the church. Right. And the church isn't saying that you can't be gay and in the church, but they certainly are saying you can't be married in the church. What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
not
gee.
necessarily where you stand. I guess it is where you stand per se. But I mean, what are your thoughts on? I mean, is that truly the Big T tradition that, and there's a reason for that, and
Right.
it is what it is, or do you think that that's going to get degraded over time? Or does it matter?
Well, think how fast all of this has changed. This is the first thing to think about, how fast all of this is changing. 5 or 6 years ago, if you asked Barack Obama, what is marriage? Oh, marriage is between a man and a woman. Yeah, and we have to reinforce this. And, you hear all his talks on that. Hillary Clinton, marriage is between a man and a woman. The sanctity of marriage, all of that, that's what they were saying 5 years ago, 6 years ago, whatever it was, 7 years ago. Now, if you say something like that, you're considered racist or bigoted, homophobic
right.
and bigoted. And so, I mean, at least give people who have been around for, in my case, 73 years, at least give me a little time to adjust. Give the people in my parish some time to come to grips with the Supreme Court.
Well, yeah, so that's a state issue, right? That you're
Right.
talking about there.
Right.
I'm talking about the Catholic Church.
Well, that's what I'm talking about too. So, first, with this change in our state law there, that now gay marriage is part of the law of the land. How is that going to change in the church? I think that what's going to probably happen is that the definition of marriage, of the word marriage, is going to have to change. Maybe change it to matrimony, which was the traditional title for marriage in the church. The sacrament of matrimony, or sacred marriage, whatever it is, it's going to change, and that's
so you
what.
think that the Catholic Church will let it happen eventually?
No, what I'm saying is the church is going to say that's what marriage is for in the Catholic Church. Marriage, they'll accept gay marriage in the state. Well, they'll say,
I see.
But if you want to be married in the sacrament of matrimony in the Catholic Church, that's different from the civil
union.
Civil unions. Yeah.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that the Catholic Church is going to come to grips with the fact that marriage by the state is okay with 2 men or 2 women. But my question is the church...
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's been, not enough time has passed for us to see how that's going to change.
All right.
I cannot see it changing in my lifetime.
I can't see it changing either because, I mean, some people I've heard have said that the state will force the Catholic Church to do that, and that's a separation of church and state.
But you read the Bible, and it's so clear.
Between a man and a woman.
From the first chapter of Genesis, God created them male and female.
Well, because the point is it's for procreation.
Right.
Right?
That's right.
That's right. And you can't have procreation between 2 men and 2 women.
But now we're finding that you can.
Well, yeah, I mean, medical science seems to change everything in some way, shape, or
So,
form.
I mean, and all of this DNA and all, there's so many things are changing so rapidly that to say anything with any real clarity is, you're on thin ice.
Well, it is a transitioning time for us.
Right. But
I like the fact that I like the fact that you're hopeful on religion in general,
Right.
and that it is expanding and it's not contracting, and that people are coming back to the faith and coming back to some faith.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the thing that I worry about the most in this country is that the radical left for sure in this country is doing everything it can to demonize religion,
Right.
and the government doesn't do anything to really help religion. And it looks like they want to change tax policy so that religious institutions will have to pay some sort of tax on like employee benefits or something like that, and that's the slippery slope, right? That's where it starts.
Yeah, but
And that's a problem.
people are still religious despite the government and the progressive movement in this country.
Thank God for that.
They're still religious. Religion is still a huge force in our public life. You remember when the Soviet Union, when it fell, the fall of the government?
Yes.
So all of a sudden, all of the Russian Orthodox people, they all came out of the woodwork.
That's right.
And those people stayed religious all through all of those years.
Well, and you look at what's happening in China right now, for instance. I mean, the persecution of Christians
Yeah.
in China.
Yeah.
And I just read an article today.
Yeah.
They're killing Muslims
Yeah.
in China now. So
Yeah.
I don't know where people get off saying that communism and socialism is the way to go.
No, I don't either.
Not if you're a God-loving religious person.
Right.
Right. So you've got you come out, you live in the desert, but you come out here and you work on the weekends still saying mass.
I come out on weekends, on Fridays, Thursday night, and I stay through the weekend.
And you're enjoying that?
Yeah, I enjoyed that because I don't have to have any administrative duties, you know, and I'm needed. I'm in a profession. I never thought that I would think this, but I'm in a profession that's dwindling. That's what do you call it when a profession that's
I don't know, but AI will take over. Don't worry.
that's yeah. Well, I do have a feeling that we're going to see some kind of change in the structure of the priesthood in the coming years, whether it's because of the sexual abuse crisis or simply because of the lack of numbers
What do you know?
of priests. I mean, so the
That,
church
that came up in my last conversation as well, where the guest I had made his theory is that it's because of celibacy that priests act out, and I take the tact of, and this is just because I know a lot of priests now. The priests in general, to me, I find to be more introverted than most. Maybe not you, but it seems that the personality of a lot of priests are introverted, and that's not why I think they act out. But I think that there's some component.
No, it's not.
What do you think it is then?
Well,
Because just let me finish real quick. I think there is something about the psychological makeup of somebody who is drawn to the priesthood that maybe predisposes them to that kind of behavior.
no, definitely not. What it
Okay.
is, what the root cause of the sexual abuse crisis, such as it was, rested in the secrecy of the institution,
I see.
and that rested in the clericalism of the clergy and the bishops. And
Explain that.
clericalism to me is a sin in the church. One of the big sins in the church today.
Clericalism. What do you mean? What does that
Clerical
mean?
means that the attitude of the priest and the bishops as being superior to the lay people, and because they're superior and they have all this knowledge that the people don't have, then they have to be obeyed. And growing up, that was certainly clericalism. You know, the cleric knew he was educated, and most of the Italian people that, you know, they didn't go to college. My father was the first generation to go to college, and my mother. Before that, people didn't go. They barely knew English, so they didn't know much. And the priest came along. He had all this training in philosophy and stuff, and he lorded it over the people to a lot of extent.
But why?
And so, well,
But
I'm
why
just
does
saying-
that go to deviancy?
Well, I'm just saying that laid the foundation for the secrecy of bad stuff. There's always been bad stuff in every institution.
Sure.
I mean, there are just as many deviant teachers in our public schools
Yeah.
as there are priests. There are just as many deviant lawyers in the legal profession. Or look at Hollywood. There's just as many deviant guys.
The majority in Hollywood.
Well, there's at least as many. And I think that there's a lot could be said that the church doesn't have as much deviancy as those other institutions because of the goodwill of people who, for the most part, joined the ranks of the clergy. But we were stuck in this clerical system. And then so that the bishops were stuck when they would have a problem with a guy, oh, he's acting out, or someone would complain. Let's cover this up. We don't want this scandal to. affect our church. I mean, we have to preserve the holiness, the image. We have to preserve the image of the church above all things. And so they would say to the person, we'll take care of it, and they would transfer the priest to somewhere else, and then he would act up there. These very few, we're talking about a very few percentage-wise numbers of priests. The sad thing is, though, even one case is horrendous. But it was all covered up in an attitude of secrecy, somewhat the way the whole teachers' union covers up the deviant teachers that there are. And there are teachers today, they don't do any work. They aren't in any classroom. They don't do anything that way. But it's they're still getting their salary.
We had the recent issue at our church with Father Alex Kim, who came in, and he's out because
he was accused. Nowadays, this church has a zero tolerance policy for.
Right, but even then, though,
that was a consensual. That's a different.
It's
issue.
a different thing. It's not a child issue. He's accused of having relations with a clerical staff with staff. Okay. But the point is
again, that's something that happens in every institution, in every profession. Here's my. I don't disagree with that. I'm giving you that one. I'm giving the church that one. I think still the church has that clerical attitude that you're discussing, though, where and that's a problem. And that
right?
comes about through, and that comes about partially through celibacy. That reinforces that clericalism. That separateness.
Well, there's a camaraderie there between.
That you're separate. You're separate, and you're not. You're superior to the. To the lay people.
Which reinforces my.
But now the lay people are more than educated, more than the priests.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that reinforces my my theory or my position that cops and priests are more closely aligned than people would seem to understand.
And soldiers too.
And soldiers, that's right. And it's because of that camaraderie and that
right.
position of authority and knowing more than the lay.
You don't think there's any deviancy in the?
It's 20% in the police department. Well, not 20% deviant, but there's 20% of them are on antidepressants or have issues.
But it's the reason why I have such a strong affinity for the police and the soldiers. Their jobs.
Oh, they're
dangerous jobs that they have.
Difficult, very difficult.
Yeah, so I have a lot of respect for those professions. Well, they have their problems. Jeez.
Well, I certainly walked away from my time with you, being the pastor, having knowing full well that I was never ever going to have that experience again. With being able to come into your home, the rectory there, and to watch that camaraderie and that closeness between priests.
Right.
I was never going to get to see that again, and I knew what I was witnessing was really special.
Okay, well,
and I do appreciate that. I was
of a generation that grew up with, as I say, with that Vatican Council attitude of opening up the church. Yeah. Now I'm afraid the people being ordained today are going back to an older clericalism. I notice that among the younger clergy. They're going back to why? Well, they don't remember the church of the 1950s. If they did, they wouldn't want to go back to to that kind of thing. So, but they don't understand it, and so but they know that they don't like what we have today, and who does, because there's so much fragmentation. So they're resorting to going back to a traditionalism that's with a small t, if you want, of stuff that's not important, but it's important to that clerical caste. So I'm afraid that's going to be with us now for a good while.
Well, let's leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. Do you think there are people that have listened to this whole thing?
There will be people, yes, that listen to this whole thing. Absolutely, for sure.
Well, okay. Well, great. Well,
and they will have gotten something good from it, I guarantee.
Well, I hope so. I hope that it was enlightening a little bit to somebody.
Actually, so much of what you said was enlightening. I'm absolutely fascinated by the history, right, and
Yeah,
that
right.
change, that marker of birth control and whatnot,
Yeah, I think
being
that.
such a
I think
significant change.
It's a big deal.
That
Yeah.
coupled with all the turmoil and strife in the '60s in general.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
Well, good. Thanks for coming by.
Well, thanks, Cameron. Thanks for having me.
Don Romito. It's wonderful to be with you.
Same here, Cameron Jackson.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Cameron Jackson Show. Remember, you can listen to us on podcast or watch us on YouTube. We want to know what you think. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you'd like to see more of. Leave your comments down below. We read them all. You can also contact us via email, CameronJacksonShow@gmail.com. And if you liked what you saw today, give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. This studio is funded by my company, C. Jackson Investigations. Need to find someone, run a background check, or catch a cheating spouse? C. Jackson Investigations can handle all of your investigative needs. To learn more, go to cjacksoninvestigations.com.